This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this narration of Myrrha and Cinyras, a haunting masterpiece of ancient psychological horror. Framed as a warning from the legendary singer Orpheus, this tale explores the devastating collision between forbidden desire and the laws of civilization. We will follow a princess's descent into a divine sickness, her desperate flight across the desert, and her ultimate metamorphosis into a weeping tree. Prepare for a journey through mythic shadows, where the most bitter of tragedies gives life to the most beautiful of gods. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Architect of Order and the Stygian Curse. The story of Myrrha and Cinyras does not emerge from a vacuum of history. It is a song of warning performed by the legendary Thracian singer Orpheus. Having turned his back on the love of women following the second loss of Eurydice, Orpheus chooses this specific tale to reflect his own shift in orientation and his preoccupation with girls punished for forbidden desire. Before the first note is even struck, he issues a chilling, direct warning to his audience. I beg that daughters and fathers should hold themselves aloof from this performance. Or, if my songs find favor, let them refuse to believe this part of my tale, and let them suppose that the deed was never done. This framing establishes the narrative not merely as a myth, but as a psychological horror so profound that the narrator himself questions the safety of the listener. The setting is the sun-drenched landscape of Cyprus, an island held as the birthplace of Aphrodite. At the center of this kingdom stands King Cinyras, a figure who represents the pinnacle of human achievement and cultural order. Cinyras was not merely a wealthy monarch, he was a hero king and a civilizer who sought to elevate humanity above the raw state of nature. Ancient traditions credit him with the invention of the hammer, the lever, and the anvil, the very tools of the forge that allowed man to master metal. He was said to have discovered the island's copper mines and invented the tiles that provided shelter and structure to human dwellings. As a high priest of Aphrodite and a favorite of Apollo, Cinyras embodied the civilized world, where human ingenuity and religious piety worked in harmony to create a stable society. Yet, as Orpheus observes with biting irony, Cinyras would have been counted among the happiest of men had he never become a father. The tragedy was sparked by the classic mythological trap of hubris, though the sin was not Myrrha's. It was her mother, Queen Cenyras, who committed the ultimate act of pride by boasting that her daughter's beauty surpassed even that of Aphrodite. In the ancient world, such a claim was a direct challenge to the divine hierarchy. Aphrodite, feeling slighted, decided to punish the family through a psychological curse that would rot the lineage from within. Crucially, Orpheus emphasizes that Cupid had nothing to do with this. His arrows, which usually sparked the fires of erotic romance, were kept far from Myrrha. Instead, the curse was kindled by a fury who rose from the depths of the underworld, brandishing a firebrand from the sticks and shaking poisoned vipers from her hair. This distinction is vital. Myrrha's feelings were not a natural attraction, but a divine sickness, a hellish venom shot into her veins that turned her own mind into a battlefield. This sickness is reflected in the very etymology of her name. Derived from the Semitic roots myrrh or more, the name Myrrha signifies bitter, while later traditions would link this to the resin of the tree. In the context of her initial curse, it represents the bitterness of a soul possessed by a desire that violates the very order her father spent his life building. As the curse took hold, Myrrha found herself consumed by an insatiable, obsessive lust for Cinyras. She was a princess of high moral standing, fully aware of the horror of her desires, yet she could not look away. She was pursued by crowds of the most eligible suitors, monarchs of the Orient and neighboring monarchs who contended for her hand in marriage. To any other princess, these men represented the height of power and romance, but to Myrrha they were invisible. Her eyes were fixed solely on the man who had given her life.
This internal conflict led Myrrha to engage in a sophisticated philosophical debate regarding the tension between natural law and human morality. In her desperation, she looked toward the animal kingdom to find a justification for her feelings, contrasting the freedom of the wild with the spiteful laws of her father's civilized world. She observed that a heifer does not feel shame when she is mounted by her sire, nor does a horse make a scandal of taking his mother mare as a bride. She saw the lusty ram and the salacious goat consorting with their own offspring, and the birds of the air conceiving with those who hatched them. To Myrrha, it seemed that nature allowed what the jealous laws of men forbade. She lamented that human beings, in their quest to build a society of tiles, anvils, and hammers, had created chains upon the very instincts that nature provided. She argued that man lived as a slave of his own making, suggesting that the incest taboo was merely an overcare by busy senates to make humans better than their kind can bear.
This debate touches on a fundamental question. Where is the line between our biological selves and our cultural identities? Myrrha imagined that there might be wise nations in distant lands where such unions were celebrated, where piety was doubled by the blending of fatherly and husbandly love. But even as she constructed these intellectual defenses, she could not escape the visceral reality of her own culture. She knew that in Cyprus her love was a monstrous mixture. She feared the infernal bands of the Furies, imagining them brandishing their Stygian torches as punishment for her debauched soul. The paradox of her situation was that the very proximity of her father was what kept him out of reach. She famously lamented, "Because he is mine, he is never mine. Because he is near to me, he is far from me." If Cinyras had been a stranger from a foreign shore, she could have traveled to him and loved him openly. But the biological bond of kindred blood acted as an insurmountable barrier, making the man she loved most the one man she could never truly possess. The psychological toll of this forbidden desire began to manifest as a profound depression. Myrrha considered traveling to a foreign land just to restore herself to herself, hoping that by ceasing to behold him, she might cease to love him. But the obsession was too strong. She stayed, feeding her famished sight on his face and receiving his fatherly kisses, each of which felt like a secret venom firing her blood. She was trapped in a cycle of retracting and making vows, stopping and returning, her mind swaying like a great tree being hewn by an axe. It sways this way and that, threatening to fall in any direction, until finally it finds no rest save in the thought of death. Myrrha reached a point where she believed that the only way to protect her father's honor and her own soul was to end her life, seeing suicide as a final act of devotion to the code of nature she had nearly defiled. One afternoon, King Cinyras, seeing his daughter in such deep distress, tried to comfort her. He was a man who took pride in his daughter's apparent maidenly modesty and the order of his household. When he asked her what kind of husband she desired from the many suitors of the Orient available to her, she looked him in the eye and simply said, "One like you." Cinyras, completely misinterpreting her words as a sign of daughterly piety, dried her tears and praised her for her devotion. He told her to continue being such a loving daughter. The word pious felt like a blow to Myrrha, a reminder of the secret guilt she carried. This moment of fatherly tenderness only served to fuel her inner fire, making the gap between her reality and her father's perception even more agonizing. As the midnight hour approached, Myrrha's despair reached its peak. She decided that death was the only exit from a world that would never allow her to be happy. She prepared a girdle, a simple belt, and tied it to a beam in her chamber. Her final words were a soft farewell to the father she loved too much, a plea for him to not hate her when he eventually learned why she died. She placed the noose around her neck, ready to choke out her breath and silence the conflict between her nature and her law. It was at this precise moment of ultimate crisis that the external world finally broke into her internal prison, as her old nurse, who had been keeping a faithful guard outside the door, heard the murmurs of despair. This transition from a private, silent struggle to a shared, active deception would soon move the tragedy out of the realm of thought and into the realm of irrevocable action. What happens when the architect of civilization is forced to confront the very animal instincts his laws were designed to suppress?
Chapter 2. The Cerealia and the Nurse's Wicked Promise. The moment the nurse bursts into the room and cuts the girdle from Myrrha's neck marks a pivotal shift in the story, moving it from a private internal struggle into a shared, active conspiracy. In the version of the myth preserved by Antoninus Liberalis, this woman is identified by the name Hippolyte, a detail that adds a layer of historical specificity to a character who often functions as a nameless archetype. Hippolyte is the surrogate mother, a woman whose life has been defined by her service to the royal house of Cyprus, and whose loyalty is rooted in the biological reality of caretaking rather than the abstract demands of divine law. When she sees the instruments of death, her reaction is visceral and loud. She shrieks, she beats her breast, and she tears at her own clothes in a frantic display of grief. But once the immediate danger of the noose is removed, she shifts into a role of relentless interrogation. Myrrha remains stubbornly silent at first, her eyes fixed on the ground in a display of sullen resentment toward the woman who has denied her the only escape she could imagine. But Hippolyte is persistent, utilizing every emotional and psychological lever at her disposal. She bears her own withered breasts, adjourning Myrrha by the kindly food the girl once drew from those dry fountains. This is a powerful appeal to the primal bond between nurse and charge, suggesting that because Hippolyte gave Myrrha life through her own body, she has a right to know what is destroying that life. When emotional appeals fail, the nurse turns to a more pragmatic and forceful tactic. She explicitly threatens to go to King Cinyras and reveal Myrrha's suicide attempt, a move that would shatter the king's perception of his daughter's maidenly modesty and force the secret into the light of the court. To soften the blow of this threat, Hippolyte offers a suite of specific remedies tailored to the various causes of human misery. She is a woman of the old world who believes that every affliction has a corresponding cure. If Myrrha's distress is the furiosa libido, the nurse claims to have charms and medicines that can dampen the heart's fire. If the girl is suffering from an evil eye or a curse, Hippolyte promises to counter it with powerful verse and incantations. If the sickness is a divine punishment, she offers to appease the offended gods with prayers and sacrifices. This list of remedies highlights the nurse's belief that even the most profound spiritual crisis can be managed through ritual and craft. She lists the reasons why Myrrha should be happy. Her house is flourishing, her mother is alive, and her father is a kind surviving king.
It is at the mention of her father's name that Myrrha finally breaks. The nurse recalls the ironic dialogue that had taken place earlier that afternoon, when Cinyras, seeing his daughter's tears, had asked what kind of husband she desired. Myrrha had looked him in the eye and replied, "One like you." At the time, the king had praised her for her daughterly piety. But as Hippolyte watches Myrrha's visceral reaction to the name, the profound sigh, the trembling of her limbs, the true meaning of those words begins to dawn on her. The nurse lulls the girl in her lap, stroking her hair, and promising that no breath of air shall on the secret blow, specifically vowing that her father will never know. It is only when Myrrha finally whispers, "O mother, happy in your husband," that the nurse's realization is complete. The reaction of Hippolyte is one of pure, unadulterated horror. A cold shiver runs through her limbs, and her hair stands on end as she realizes the depth of the impious love her charge is harboring. She understands the weight of a crime against nature and begs Myrrha to abandon this passion, to suppress the infatuation before it destroys the royal lineage. But Myrrha is resolute. She has reached a point where she can no longer live with her desire and cannot live without its fulfillment. She gives the nurse an ultimatum. She will return to the noose if she cannot have her father. Faced with the choice between allowing the girl she loves to kill herself or facilitating a crime that violates every sacred statute of gods and men, Hippolyte chooses the girl's life. In a moment that defines her as both a savior and a villain, she tells Myrrha to live, making the wicked promise: "You shall have your father."
To fulfill this promise, Hippolyte must wait for a specific window of opportunity, which arrives during the sacred festival of Ceres, known as the Cerealia. In the ancient world, the timing of a crime was often as significant as the crime itself. And Ovid places the incest of Myrrha and Cinyras during this period of intense religious observance. Ceres was the goddess of grain, the earth's fertility, and the social order that governs marriage and motherhood. During her festival, the worshipping women, including Queen Centres, were required to observe a strict period of ritual purity. For 9 nights, they were forbidden from touching men, and they spent this time in the temple, separated from their husbands and the domestic sphere. The significance of the 9 nights of purity cannot be overstated. This ritual was intended to preserve the thesmoi, the sacred laws that kept the city and the family in harmony with the gods. By using this specific time to facilitate an incestuous union, Hippolyte and Myrrha are subverting the very essence of the goddess's rites. They are turning a time of purity into a time of defilement, and a celebration of natural fertility into the creation of a monstrous mixture. The festival creates a vacuum in the royal household. The king is left alone, his bed empty, and his usual moral anchor, the queen, is occupied with the service of the gods. The nurse finds King Cinyras in a vulnerable state, his senses dulled by the wine of the festivities and the loneliness of his wife's absence.
Hippolyte approaches the king with a carefully constructed lie. She tells him of a young girl, a virgin of exalted parentage, who is deeply and truly in love with him. She gives a false name and describes the girl as being exactly Myrrha's age. Cinyras, in his wine-soaked state, is intrigued. The nurse's description of the girl's age is a chilling detail. It suggests that Cinyras may have already harbored a repressed attraction to the youth and beauty of a girl like his daughter. He does not ask for her name or her lineage, perhaps because the secrecy of the affair appeals to his sense of adventure, or perhaps because his judgment is simply too clouded. He bids the nurse to fetch the girl and bring her to his chamber. As the night of the first meeting arrives, the natural world itself seems to recoil from the coming crime. Ovid describes several ominous signs that Myrrha ignores as she makes her way toward her father's bedroom. The moon, sensing the horror, hides behind the clouds, and the stars, specifically the figures of Icarus and Aragone, who represent filial devotion, withdraw their light from the sky. The night is described as being blind, a fitting metaphor for the moral blindness of the participants. As Myrrha walks through the dark palace, she stumbles 3 times, a traditional omen of disaster. 3 times the screech owl, a messenger of death and ill fortune from the banks of the Styx, sends its hollow cry through the air. Any one of these signs should have been enough to turn her back, but the venom in her veins and the nurse's firm hand on her arm drive her forward. The journey through the palace is a masterpiece of atmospheric tension. They move in complete silence, Myrrha's hand trembling in the nurse's grip. They reach the king's door, and Hippolyte enters first, whispering to Cinyras that his mistress has arrived. She presents the girl to him in the pitch-black room.
This darkness is not just a practical necessity to hide Myrrha's identity. It is a symbolic space where social laws and familial identities are temporarily suspended. In the dark, Cinyras is not a father, and Myrrha is not a daughter. They are simply a man and a woman. But the tragedy is that they can never truly shed those identities. Ovid notes with a biting irony that during the act, Cinyras called her daughter as a term of endearment for a younger lover, and she called him father in return. In this way, the right names were attached to their impious actions, even if only one of them understood the literal truth of those words. The physical act is a violation of the code of nature, a union that produces a monstrous mixture in the bloodline. Myrrha leaves the chamber having successfully deceived the man who should have been her protector, but the deception does not end with a single night. Hippolyte and Myrrha continue the affair for several subsequent nights, taking advantage of the queen's continued absence at the festival of Ceres. Each night, Myrrha returns to her father's bed, her guilt growing alongside the secret life beginning to take root in her womb. The nurse remains the facilitator, the one who ensures the darkness is complete, and the king remains unsuspecting.
This violation of the Cerealia resonated deeply with ancient audiences, because the gods were seen as active forces that demanded respect. By conducting an incestuous affair while the queen was performing the holy rites of Ceres, Myrrha and the nurse were not just committing a social crime, they were committing a religious one. They were inviting the wrath of the gods into the very heart of the palace. Hippolyte's role in this is particularly complex. She represents the natural survival instinct that ignores the cultural laws of the city. She sees a girl dying of love and provides the only cure she can find, regardless of the cost to the social order. Her good intentions to save a life lead directly to a crime that the gods cannot ignore. As the affair continues, the tension within the palace becomes almost unbearable. Myrrha is living a double life, acting as the devoted daughter by day and the incestuous lover by night. The nurse is the only one who knows the truth, and she must maintain a constant vigil to ensure that no one else discovers the secret. The psychological weight of this deception is immense. Myrrha is no longer the innocent princess who spurned her suitors. She is a woman who has crossed a line from which there is no return. She has defiled the code of nature, and she knows that the punishment, when it comes, will be as great as the crime. The violation of the Cerealia also serves as a metaphor for the broader breakdown of the family unit. Ceres is the goddess who brings order to the world through the cultivation of the earth and the establishment of laws. By breaking her laws, Myrrha and the nurse are inviting chaos back into the kingdom. The palace, which should be a place of safety and order, becomes a place of shadows and lies. The biological bond between father and daughter, which should be the most sacred of all ties, is twisted into something unrecognizable. This is the horror that Orpheus warned his audience about at the beginning of the song. It is a story of how a single forbidden desire, facilitated by a misplaced loyalty, can lead to the total destruction of a family and a kingdom. As the final night of the affair approaches, the sense of impending doom reaches a fever pitch. The king's curiosity, which has been suppressed by wine and the darkness, finally begins to stir. He wants to know the identity of the woman who has brought him such pleasure. He wants to see the face of the girl who is the same age as his daughter. This desire for knowledge is what will ultimately shatter the deception and lead to the final violent confrontation. Hippolyte's plan, which relied entirely on the cover of darkness and the king's intoxication, is about to face the one thing it cannot survive: the light. What happens when the architect of civilization is forced to see the face of the one who has shared his bed? Chapter 3: The Lamp of Revelation and the Flight from Filicide. Orpheus, the narrator of this harrowing descent, begins this movement of his song with a curious and distancing rhetorical flourish. He pauses to congratulate his own homeland, Thrace, for its geographical distance from the land where this horror occurred. "I congratulate the Ismarians," he sings, "and our own land, that it is far from such a crime." This distancing serves as a psychological buffer, framing the events in Cyprus as an exotic, foreign infection that the civilized world of the North should view with detached dread. He even offers a rare alternative tradition for the curse's origin. While many blame the Furies, some whispered that Helios, the sun god, inflicted the madness as a punishment, perhaps seeing in the royal house of Cyprus a reflection of the same solar hubris that plagued his own lineage. The darkness that had served as both a shield and a sanctuary for Myrrha could not last forever. In the logic of ancient tragedy, the secret is a living thing that eventually demands to be seen. And in the story of Myrrha and Cinyras, that visibility arrives through the literal and metaphorical power of the lamp. For several nights, the king had remained in a state of satisfied ignorance, his senses dulled by wine and the carefully constructed lies of the nurse. He had grown accustomed to the presence of this mysterious young woman who arrived in the dead of night and vanished before the first light of dawn. But curiosity is a fundamental human drive, and for a man of Cinyras' stature, the desire to know the face of the woman who had brought him such profound pleasure became an obsession that outweighed the nurse's warnings. The moment of revelation is one of the most physically and emotionally charged scenes in the entire Ovidian narrative. It occurs in the deepest hour of the night, at a time when the night should have been at its most protective. Cinyras, perhaps feeling a surge of affection or a simple masculine need for mastery over the situation, decided to break the one rule that had governed their union. He brought a lamp into the bedroom. The physical act of lighting the flame was the beginning of the end. In the ancient world, the lamp was not just a tool for sight, it was a symbol of truth, reason, and the social order. By bringing light into the chamber, Cinyras was inadvertently bringing the laws of the city and the eyes of the gods into a space that had been defined by their absence. As the flame flickered to life, the shadows that had confounded their identities were suddenly swept away. The light hit Myrrha's face, and in that instant the world of the palace was shattered. The shock of recognition for Cinyras was not just a personal betrayal, it was a cosmic horror. He saw the face of the loving daughter he had praised for her piety, the girl who was the same age as his own child, and realized that she was one and the same as the mistress who had occupied his bed. The playful use of familiar names in the dark now took on a literal, crushing weight. The light did not just reveal Myrrha, it revealed Cinyras to himself as a man who had committed the ultimate crime against nature. The light did not just reveal Myrrha, it revealed Cinyras to himself as a man who had committed the ultimate crime against nature. The reaction of King Cinyras was instantaneous and violent. He did not sink into a state of mournful contemplation or seek a legal remedy. He moved directly toward filicide. In the ancient mythological framework, filicide, the killing of one's own child, was often seen as the only possible response to a violation of the familial order that was too great to be borne. By drawing his sword, Cinyras was attempting to cut the stain of incest out of his bloodline. He was no longer a father in that moment. He was an executioner, a man driven by a righteous rage that sought to restore the family's honor through the shedding of the daughter's blood. This shift from lover to killer is a hallmark of the Thyestes undercurrent that scholars have identified in this story. The audience would have recognized the parallel to the house of Atreus, where Thyestes was famously tricked into eating his own children and later committed incest with his daughter Pelopia to sire a son who would act as his instrument of vengeance. In the bedroom of Cinyras, the roles of father, lover, and executioner are similarly collapsed into a single blood-stained identity. Just as the house of Tantalus was defined by siblings eating their children and fathers raping their daughters, the house of Cinyras was now defined by a father attempting to slaughter the child who carried his own seed. Myrrha's escape was facilitated by the very darkness she had once feared. As Cinyras lunged for her with his sword, the lamp was likely extinguished or dropped in the chaos, and the palace was plunged back into a temporary gloom. This darkness, which had previously been a tool for the crime, now became a tool for survival. Myrrha fled from the royal bedchamber, through the winding halls of the palace, and out into the blind night of Cyprus. She was saved, Ovid tells us, because the shadows hid her from her father's sight, allowing her to slip past the guards and out into the wilderness. But this was not a clean escape. It was the beginning of a long, agonizing exile. The flight of Myrrha is described as a journey that lasted for 9 months, a duration that is intentionally aligned with the period of human gestation. This detail transforms her flight into a protracted biological labor. Every step she took away from her father's kingdom was a step closer to the birth of the child conceived in the dark. She was carrying the physical evidence of her crime within her own body, and as her belly grew, the weight of her transgression became a literal burden that she had to carry across the desert. She was no longer just a princess in exile. She was a vessel for a monstrous mixture that was growing stronger as she grew weaker. The geography of her flight is specific and evocative. She moved away from the civilized center of Cyprus and toward the exotic eastern fringes of the known world. Ovid describes her passing through the palms of Arabia and the fields of Panchaea. In the ancient imagination, Panchaea was a mythical land of incredible wealth and sweetness, a place where the earth produced balsam, cinnamon, and causticum sweet, and where the ground wept frankincense without the need for human labor. There is a profound irony in Myrrha traversing this landscape. She was a woman whose life had become bitter, passing through the sweetest lands on earth. The fragrance of the cinnamon and the balsam must have served as a cruel contrast to the internal rot she felt within her own soul. As she moved through Arabia, Myrrha was an outcast from both human society and the natural order. She had violated the laws of the city, and she had perverted the instincts of nature. She was in a state of total isolation, a woman who belonged to no one and nowhere. The 9 months of wandering were not just a physical journey, but a psychological descent. She was afraid of death and tired of life, a state of being that left her suspended in a terrifying middle ground. She could not return to the palace where her father waited with a sword, and she could not find a place in the wild where she could truly belong. She was a ghost of a princess, a living shadow moving through the sun-drenched palms of the east. The concept of filicide hangs over this entire journey. Even though Cinyras was no longer physically pursuing her with a sword in the later months, the threat he represented remained the defining feature of her exile. In Ovid's telling, the king is left behind, his sword swinging its shadows as his daughter vanishes into the night. However, the mythological record offers darker resolutions. Antoninus Liberalis records that Cinyras, unable to live with the revelation, committed suicide immediately. Yet another tradition suggests a more divine end, that Cinyras, the master of the lyre and the forge, was eventually killed by Apollo himself in a musical contest that turned into a contest of swords, a fitting end for a man whose house had become a discord of nature. During these 9 months, Myrrha's psychological state began to shift from the furiosa libido that had driven her to the crime toward a deep, crushing remorse. She realized that her existence was a paradox. She was a mother who was also a sister, and her child was a son who was also a brother. The sacred names of the family had been so thoroughly confounded that she could no longer find a way to navigate her own identity. She was a woman who had debauched the body through the soul, and she felt that her very presence was a defilement of the earth she walked upon. This led her to reach a point of total exhaustion, both physical and spiritual, by the time she reached the land of Sabea. It is in the land of Sabea that Myrrha's journey reached its biological and mythological conclusion. She was 9 months pregnant, her body swollen and weary, and she could go no further. She was trapped between the looming reality of childbirth and the ongoing threat of her father's wrath. Exhausted and trapped, she offered a final prayer for a third way between life and death. The flight from Filicide thus ends not with a return to safety, but with a departure from humanity itself. Myrrha had spent 9 months running from a father who wanted to kill her, and she ended that journey by asking the gods to kill the princess within her, while allowing the life within her to survive in a different form. The child Adonis, who had been the silent passenger on this 9-month journey, was now ready to be born, but his mother was no longer a woman who could hold him. She was becoming a landmark, a tree in the desert of Cerealia, a permanent memorial to a love that had broken the world. The transition from the human to the arboreal is the final stage of the flight. Myrrha's feet, which had walked past the palms of Arabia, began to take root in the soil of Cerealia. The seed of her father was still within her, but the vessel was changing. The blind night of her crime had led to the cruel light of the lamp, which in turn had led to the bitter exile of the desert. Each phase of the story moved her further away from the light of the city and deeper into the shadows of the natural world. The lamp of revelation had done its work. It had exposed the truth and set the tragedy in motion, and now the story was ready to move into the final miraculous stage of metamorphosis.
The physical reality of her pregnancy during this flight cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, a pregnant woman was often seen as being in a state of sacred or taboo transition, and Myrrha's pregnancy was the most taboo of all. She was carrying a child that was a crime against nature, yet that child was also the only future she had left. The 9 months of wandering were a time of profound physical suffering, as she lacked the comforts of the palace and the support of her family. She was a royal princess reduced to a desert wanderer, a woman whose only companion was the growing life that was a constant reminder of her own impious actions. The geography of the flight also serves as a metaphor for the orientalization of the myth. By moving Myrrha from Cyprus to Arabia and Cerealia, the ancient storytellers were linking the Greek and Roman versions of the tale back to its Semitic and Phoenician roots. The myrrh tree was a real plant that grew in these eastern lands, and by placing the climax of the story there, they were providing an etiology for the existence of the resin. The precious nature of the resin reflected the royal status of the woman who had become the tree. The flight was not just an escape, it was a homecoming to the botanical origins of her name.
As the metamorphosis began, the psychic struggle that had defined her life was finally silenced. She was no longer a daughter fleeing from Filicide. She was a tree standing in the sun of Cerealia. The sword of Cinyras could no longer reach her, and the shame of her mother could no longer touch her. She had found her third way, but it was a way that required the total sacrifice of her human identity. The child within her, however, remained, a living weight inside the wood, waiting for the moment when the bark would split and a new kind of beauty would enter the world. The story of the lamp and the flight is a reminder of the power of the unseen to disrupt the seen. The darkness of the affair was a fragile piece that was shattered by the simple act of bringing light into the room. The flight that followed was a desperate attempt to outrun the consequences of that revelation, a journey that spanned the length of a pregnancy and the breadth of the Eastern world. It was a journey that transformed a princess into an outcast and a mother into a tree, setting the stage for the final, strange birth that would conclude the tragedy. The right names that had been attached to their actions in the dark were now carved into the very history of the landscape, a permanent record of a family that had been destroyed by a single, forbidden desire. As the wood began to tighten around the unborn Adonis, the question remained, could a child born from such a bitter flight ever truly escape the shadow of his origin?
Chapter 4. The Nerveless Limbo of the Weeping Wood. When Myrrha finally collapsed upon the sun-scorched soil of Cerealia, the 9-month flight that had carried her across the vast reaches of the East reached its silent conclusion. She was no longer the princess who had fled her father's sword. She was a woman who had reached the absolute boundary of human endurance. In this state of total exhaustion, carrying the heavy, pulsing evidence of her transgression, Myrrha stood on the threshold of a transformation that would redefine her place in the universe. She was an outcast whose very existence challenged the boundaries of the natural and moral world. And it was here, at the edge of the known world, that she offered her final desperate plea to the heavens. Her prayer was a unique request for a nerveless limbo, a state of being where the anguishing consciousness of her guilt could be silenced without the finality of a human death. Myrrha understood that she had committed a crime so profound that she could no longer walk among the living without defiling the earth. Yet she was equally terrified of the world of the dead, fearing that her shame would follow her into the afterlife, and that her presence in the underworld would be a further stain on the order of things. She begged the gods to remove her from both realms, seeking a third way that would grant her oblivion. This plea hints at a deeper undercurrent in the myth, the suggestion that the fatherlust she experienced might be an unspoken universal of human experience, a terrifying potential that requires a radical removal from the social sphere to be processed.
The gods granted her request through a metamorphosis that was not a sudden vanishing, but a visceral reclamation of the human by the botanical. It began at her feet, the very parts of her body that had carried her in exile. As she stood in the Sabaean soil, her toes stretched and burrowed, losing their soft shape to become the rough, searching anchors of a root system. The earth did not just receive her, it began to grow up through her. This grounding was the first step in her removal from the world of human action and movement. She was being fixed to a single point in the landscape, a permanent monument to her own story. The transformation moved upward with a relentless, creeping pace. The skin of her ankles and shins began to harden and thicken, taking on the rough, ridged texture of bark, a protective layer that was also a prison. The marrow of her bones, the seat of her noble and cursed lineage, changed its very substance, turning into the hard, unyielding heartwood of a tree. Her blood, which had been fired by the venom of the Furies, slowed and thickened, transforming into a viscous, aromatic sap. This metamorphosis serves what some critics call a naturalizing effect. It alters the idea of incest into something natural for the imagination to contemplate. By shifting Myrrha from the realm of human morality to the realm of botany, the myth makes the monstrous act part of the natural landscape, where such unions are no longer governed by the laws of the city. As the bark reached her waist, it began to encase the most complicated part of her tragedy, her pregnant womb. This created a strange and haunting biological paradox. Myrrha was no longer a woman, yet she remained a mother. She was a tree that carried a human child, a vessel of wood protecting a life of flesh and bone. The tree did not merely hide Myrrha, it incarnated the secret. The tree became the secret made wood, a physical manifestation of a truth that could not be spoken in the world of men. The gods did not terminate the pregnancy during the metamorphosis. Instead, they preserved the child within the tightening grip of the trunk. The tree became a living nursery, a silent guardian of a life that was literally growing beneath its bark. The metamorphosis continued until it reached her chest and neck, finally silencing the voice that had once debated the nature of law and desire. This silencing was a return to the state of nature. In the ancient world, the taboo of incest marked the fundamental difference between culture and nature. By violating this most fundamental rule of human society, Myrrha was essentially stripped of her status as a cultural being and returned to the silence of the wild. Some interpretations suggest that this silencing was a punishment for her initial refusal of conventional sexual relations.
By spurning her suitors and denying the natural path of Aphrodite's influence, she had provoked the very incest that now forced her into the voicelessness of the botanical world. She was rendered unable to break the taboo again because she no longer possessed the tools of human communication. Her story was no longer hers to tell. It belonged to the landscape. Finally, the bark covered her face and her hair, which branched out into a crown of leaves and thorns. The transformation was complete. Where a princess had stood, there was now a Commiphora myrrh, a small thorny tree typical of the Arabian landscape. Yet even in this botanical form, myrrh's human grief found a way to manifest. The tree began to weep. The aromatic resin that exuded from its bark was seen by the ancients as the physical incarnation of Myrrha's tears. These drops of resin, which hardened into precious bitter tears, became one of the most sought-after substances in the ancient world. There is a profound circularity in this. The woman who sought to escape both life and death became the source of a substance used to preserve the dead in a state that mimicked life. This liminal state, being a tree that is also a woman, is the essence of the metamorphosis. Myrrha had found her third way. She was no longer subject to the jealous laws of men, nor was she yet subject to the finality of the grave. She existed in a space between nature and culture, a botanical incarnation of a secret that could not be spoken. The myrrh tree's thorns are a reminder of the sharp, biting pain of her conscience, while its fragrance is a reminder of the beauty she once possessed and the child she still carried. The resin does not just fall, it bleeds or drops from the bark, as if the tree is in a constant state of mourning. This permanent physical manifestation of grief serves as a reminder that metamorphosis is not an erasure of the past, but a reconfiguration of it. Myrrha's history is written into the very biology of the tree. The value of myrrh in the ancient world adds another layer of meaning to the metamorphosis. It was a substance associated with the highest levels of ritual and luxury, yet its origin was rooted in the most profound violation of sacred laws. This paradox reflects the nature of the myth itself. Out of a monstrous mixture comes something that the world deems precious and holy. The resin of the myrrh tree is bitter to the taste, echoing the bitterness of Myrrha's experience. Yet its scent is sweet and intoxicating, echoing the forbidden desire that drove her to the act. The tree does not just hide the secret, it transforms it into something that can be shared with the world in a controlled, ritualized way. The state of being a pregnant tree remains the most haunting image in the entire narrative. It challenges the understanding of the boundaries between the human and the non-human. Inside the rigid, unyielding wood, a human life continued to develop. The child was growing, its heart beating against the heartwood of the mother. This created a tension between the static nature of the tree and the dynamic growth of the infant. The tree was a vessel that was being stretched from the inside, a botanical womb that must eventually break. This state of being is the ultimate expression of liminality. The mother is gone, yet her biological function continues. She is a nursery made of wood, a silent protector of a child who will one day have to face the world she escaped. As the months passed and the child within the tree reached full term, the state of metamorphosis faced its final crisis. The wood could no longer contain the growing life within it. The nerveless limbo that Myrrha had prayed for was about to be disrupted by the most visceral of human experiences. The tree, which had served as a sanctuary and a prison, was now a barrier to the very life it was meant to protect. The tree began to groan and bend down in pain, the bark stretching to its breaking point as the living weight within the wood pressed toward the light. The transition from the silent, botanical existence of the mother back to the vocal, human existence of the son would require one final act of divine intervention.
The bark was ready to split, and the secret was ready to emerge into a world that was waiting to be captivated by a new kind of beauty. Chapter 5: The Tears of the Tree and the Bloom of Adonis. The final crack of the bark signaled the end of Myrrha's human form and the beginning of a new divine tragedy. As the wood was rent asunder by the divine touch of Lucina, the goddess of childbirth who acted as a midwife to the timber, the infant Adonis emerged from the cleft. This birth realized the paradox of the human child protected within a vessel of wood. The naiads, the nymphs of the fresh waters, were there to receive the newborn, cradling him upon a bed of soft leaves and washing him in the cool streams of the forest. In a gesture that linked the child forever to his mother's suffering, they anointed him with the aromatic myrrh, the resin that serves as the physical incarnation of Myrrha's grief. This child, though born of an impious union that had shattered the laws of the city, possessed a beauty so radiant and pure that it seemed to justify the cosmic upheaval of his conception.
While the Ovidian tradition firmly establishes Adonis as the son of Myrrha and Cinyras, the ancient world held other, more ambiguous accounts of his parentage that reflect the myth's complex evolution. Hesiod and Panaisis suggested alternative lineages, with some traditions naming Phoenix and Alphasabiah as his parents. This genealogical uncertainty highlights the myth's deep Semitic roots, where the figure of the Lord, Adonis, was a fluid archetype of vegetation, death, and rebirth. In the Levant and Phoenicia, he was often identified with Tammuz, the dying and rising god whose fate was tied to the agricultural cycle. Regardless of his specific ancestry in these varying accounts, the Adonis who emerged from the myrrh tree in the Greco-Roman tradition was a figure of such captivating grace that he would eventually draw the attention of the most powerful goddesses in the pantheon, creating a legacy of beauty that would transcend the dark circumstances of his birth.
The appearance of Adonis created an immediate and fierce rivalry between Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Persephone, the queen of the underworld. In the most enduring version of the tale, Aphrodite was so struck by the infant's beauty that she sought to hide him from the other gods, placing him in a secret chest, a larnax that served as both a cradle and a symbolic coffin, and entrusting him to Persephone for safekeeping in the depths of Hades. However, when the Queen of the Dead opened the chest and saw the child, she was equally enthralled and refused to return him to the upper world. The dispute became so bitter that Zeus, or in some accounts the muse Calliope, was forced to intervene. The divine decree established that Adonis would spend 1/3 of the year in the underworld with Persephone, 1/3 with Aphrodite in the upper world, and the final third of the year wherever he chose. Adonis, drawn to the light and the goddess of desire, chose to spend his free time with Aphrodite. This division of his life became a powerful metaphor for the cycle of the seasons, with his time in the underworld representing the dormancy of winter, and his return to the surface symbolizing the vibrant resurgence of life in spring and summer.
Adonis's life, much like his mother's, was defined by a tragic end that left a permanent mark on the natural world. Despite Aphrodite's frantic warnings to avoid dangerous beasts and the bold animals of the wild, Adonis was a passionate and reckless hunter. While pursuing a wild boar, which some whispered was the god Ares transformed by jealousy, he was gored in the thigh, a wound that proved fatal. As he lay dying in the arms of a weeping Aphrodite, his blood soaked into the earth, mixing with the goddess's nectar. From this mixture grew the anemone, a delicate, wind-blown flower with a blood-red center. The anemone is a fitting symbol for Adonis. It is beautiful but short-lived, its petals easily scattered by the very breezes that give it its name. In other accounts, it was the rose that was stained red by the blood of the dying youth, or the tears of the goddess as she rushed to his side.
The annual festival of the Adonia was established to commemorate this loss, during which women would plant gardens of Adonis, small pots of fast-growing plants like lettuce or fennel that would quickly wither in the sun, mirroring the brief and beautiful life of the boy born from the tree. The legacy of this mythic birth and death found one of its most sophisticated expressions in the works of William Shakespeare. In his narrative poem Venus and Adonis, Shakespeare explicitly links the myth to the botanical reality of the mother, describing how a purple flower springs from the blood of the slain youth. He compares the green dropping sap of a flower to Myrrha's tears, a subtle nod to the Ovidian metamorphosis that preceded the birth. More profoundly, in the tragedy of Othello, the protagonist compares his own weeping to a medicinable gum, or a myrrh tree dropping its tears in the Arabian desert. For Shakespeare, the myrrh tree was not just a botanical curiosity, but a symbol of a grief so deep that it becomes a healing substance, a medicinable sorrow that preserves the memory of the sufferer even as it marks their destruction. This ritualistic and medicinal aspect of the myth was grounded in ancient practice through the myrrhophores, the anointers or priestesses who used myrrh in sacred ceremonies. These women served as a tangible historical link between the myth and the lived experience of the ancient world. They understood myrrh not just as a perfume, but as a sacred resin that bridged the gap between the human and the divine, the living and the dead. This tradition of preservation found its most rigorous application in ancient Egypt, where myrrh was an essential element in the complex art of mummification. It was prized not only for its ability to mask the scent of mortality, but for its practical pest-repellent qualities, which protected the physical remains from the ravages of insects and decay. By treating the body with the tears of the tree, the Egyptians sought to grant the deceased a form of arboreal permanence, mirroring the way Myrrha herself was preserved within the bark. The myrrhophores' use of the resin in anointing the dead, or the sacred images of the gods, thus mirrored the naiads' anointing of the infant Adonis, suggesting that every use of myrrh was a reenactment of the child's miraculous birth and a defiance of the finality of death. The myth of Myrrha and her son underwent a series of profound transformations in post-classical literature, often serving as a vehicle for exploring the darker corners of the human psyche. One of the most harrowing depictions appears in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, Dante encounters Myrrha's soul in the 8th circle of hell, specifically in the 10th bolgia reserved for falsifiers of persons. Here, her contrapasso is a vivid manifestation of her crime. Because she abandoned human society and lost her true identity through her deception of Cinyras, she is stripped of her sanity and her humanity. Dante depicts her as a wicked and ungodly figure, plagued by madness, forced to run through the darkness and bite at the shades of others, such as the master falsifier Gianni Schicchi. This biting detail emphasizes the animalistic nature of her descent. Having sought to justify her desire through the laws of the animal kingdom, she is condemned to an eternity of bestial fury, a shadow of the princess she once was. In the late 17th century, the English poet John Dryden used the story of Myrrha and Cinyras as a vehicle for sharp political satire. In his translation of Ovid, Dryden infused the narrative with parallels to the contemporary British political landscape. For Dryden, the story was a way to critique the shifting loyalties of his time. He likely saw Myrrha as a metaphor for Queen Mary II, who had ascended the throne in place of her father, James II, during the Glorious Revolution. In this interpretation, Myrrha's occupation of her father's bed mirrored Mary's impious usurpation of her father's monarchical position. Dryden's use of monster metaphors and his critique of the Convention Parliament linked the mythological tragedy to the social confusion of the late 17th century, using the daughter who betrayed the natural line of succession to voice his dissent against the new political settlement. The tragedy of Myrrha also served as a profound inspiration for the Italian playwright Vittorio Alfieri, whose 1786 play Myrrha focused on the psychological interiority of the princess. In Alfieri's version, the focus is entirely on the emotional agony of the heroine as she prepares to marry Prince Pyrrhus, a union she eventually sabotages because of her secret, unutterable passion for her father. The play is a masterpiece of suspense and silence, culminating in a violent confrontation where Myrrha finally confesses her love to an infuriated and horrified Cinyras. Overcome by shame, she seizes her father's sword and kills herself. This portrayal of Cinyras' fate stands in contrast to alternative traditions where he either commits suicide or is killed by Apollo. Alfieri's psychological depth later inspired the composer Domenico alla Leona, whose 1920 opera Myrrha added a lush, Debussesque musical dimension to the princess's suffering, further cementing the myth's place in the modern operatic canon.
Mary Shelley and Lord Byron also drew upon the Myrrha myth to explore themes of social alienation and forbidden longing. In Shelley's 1820 novella Mathilda, the protagonist explicitly references Alfieri's tragedy, and the story features a father who confesses his incestuous love for his daughter, leading to a tragic cycle of isolation and death. For Shelley, the myth was a way to explore the devastating impact of paternal betrayal on the female psyche and the monstrous nature of domestic secrets. Byron, meanwhile, included a character named Myrrha in his tragedy Sardanapalus. While she is a Greek slave rather than the princess of the myth, Byron chose the name to evoke the themes of forbidden love and romantic longing, suggesting a relationship that was both intense and potentially destructive, mirroring the bitter legacy of her namesake. In the late 20th century, the myth experienced a resurgence in English poetry through the work of Ted Hughes and Frank Bidart. Hughes retold the story in his Tales from Ovid, making the ancient text feel fresh and visceral for a modern audience, by focusing on the psychological tension and the raw physical reality of the metamorphosis. Similarly, Frank Bidart's long poem, The Second Hour of the Night, used Myrrha's story to explore the inescapability of desire and the way it consumes the self. Bidart suggested that the precious bitter resin of the myrrh tree is a fitting metaphor for desire itself, something that is both sweet and bitter, possessing the power to destroy those who submit to it while leaving behind a permanent, fragrant record of their fall.
The influence of Myrrha's story extends into the world of music and the visual arts, where the different stages of the myth have been captured by master engravers and painters. The German engraver Virgil Solus illustrated the initial seduction, while the French engraver Bernard Picart and the Italian painter Marcantonio Franceschini both chose to depict the miraculous moment of the tree metamorphosis and the subsequent birth of Adonis. Their works often highlight the contrast between the rigid, dark bark of the tree and the soft, radiant flesh of the newborn infant, emphasizing the wood-born nature of the child. Gustave Doré created a haunting engraving of Myrrha in hell, capturing her madness as she bites at the other falsifiers in the darkness of the inferno. These artistic representations have ensured that the physical imagery of the myth, the lamp, the sword, the tree, and the resin, remains a part of the Western visual vocabulary. The legacy of Myrrha even reaches into the domain of modern science and pop culture. Her name lives on in the nomenclature of several biological species and an asteroid in the main belt of the solar system, known as 381 Myrrha. Discovered in 1894 by Auguste Charlois, this celestial body serves as a permanent cosmic memorial to the princess who sought to escape the Earth. In modern pop culture, the Adonis belt, the V-shaped muscle definition of the lower abdomen, serves as a testament to the enduring association of the name with the pinnacle of male physical beauty. The fact that a figure from an ancient story of incest and transformation is commemorated in both the stars and the gym shows the enduring power of the myth to capture the human imagination across different fields of knowledge.
The physical details of the birth, the intervention of Lucina and the anointing with myrrh, created a template for the strange and the miraculous that would be echoed in later religious traditions. The connection between myrrh and the birth of a significant male figure is famously mirrored in the New Testament, where the Magi present the infant Christ with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. While the biblical myrrh is often interpreted as a symbol of mortality and the suffering to come, its presence at a miraculous birth carries echoes of the older tradition of the boy born from the tree. This layering of meanings shows how the aromatic resin became a bridge between the pagan and the Christian worlds, carrying the scent of Myrrha's tragedy into the heart of a new religious narrative. The myrrhophores of the ancient temples find a distant reflection in the myrrh-bearing women who brought spices to the tomb, linking the bitter resin of the mother to the ultimate sacrifice of the son.
The split nature of Adonis, as the human child born from a tree, remains a recurring theme in critical interpretations of the myth. His very name became a synonym for a specific kind of youthful, doomed attraction. In ancient Greece, the word Adonis could refer to both the perfume made from myrrh and the lover who seduced goddesses, showing how the physical substance of the mother was inextricably linked to the human identity of the son. This dual identity ensured that whenever the world celebrated the beauty of Adonis, it was also, however subtly, commemorating the tragedy of Myrrha. The legacy of eternal beauty that Adonis represents is thus a beauty that is rooted in a profound and bitter loss, a beauty that, like the anemone, is destined to wither even as it blooms. If the myrrh tree is the monument to a crime against nature, then Adonis is the proof that even from the most bitter wood, something of incomparable grace can emerge. What does it say of our own world that we still use the name of this child of incest to define the very standard of human perfection?
The story of Myrrha and Cinyras remains a haunting meditation on the fragile boundary between nature's raw instincts and the civilizing laws of humanity. From the divine sickness of a daughter's obsession to her silent transformation into the weeping myrrh tree, the narrative explores how we process transgression through the creation of beauty. The birth of Adonis from this bitter wood suggests a profound paradox, that the most radiant grace can spring from the darkest origins. This myth challenges us to consider how our cultural identities are built upon the suppression of the instincts that make us human. Ultimately, we are left to wonder if the fragrance of our achievements can ever fully mask the bitterness of the roots from which they grow. Thank you for listening to this exploration of one of mythology's most enduring and complex tragedies.